A lot of people think powerlifting nutrition is just eat a ton of protein and take creatine and lift heavy. And I mean, to be fair, that's actually kind of true. Obviously, protein matters, creatine matters, calories matter. But when one of my clients or I are actually getting ready for a max out or a powerlifting meet, my nutrition gets a bit more specific. On a meet day, or even just the day that I'm maxing out in general, I'm not eating a huge steak before I squat. I'm not going to be eating a giant cheeseburger before I deadlift. I'm not trying to get a bunch of fats and proteins right before I lift. I'm mostly eating carbs. For me, this is stuff like sugary oatmeal, bananas, sugary juice, tortillas with jam, honey, and even candy. And the reason is not just that carbs give you energy, because that's technically true, but it's also way too simple. The real explanation is more interesting than that, and it's kind of what this whole video is going to be about. To understand why I eat this way and why I have my clients eat this way, we have to start with energy and the systems our bodies use to produce it. The human body uses energy from food and stored substrates to continually resynthesize adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP is the immediate cellular fuel for muscle contraction. But muscle cells only store a limited amount of ATP, so the body has to keep remaking it through overlapping energy systems. These energy systems are the phosphogen system, or ATP PCR system, the glycolytic system, and the oxidative system. When you lift a true 1 rep max, the rep itself is mostly powered by the ATP PCR system. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's basically the immediate energy currency of the cell. When your muscle contracts, ATP gets broken down into ADP plus a phosphate, and that releases energy. So very simply, ATP becomes ADP and energy is released. The problem is that your muscles do not store a huge amount of ATP. You have some ATP already available in the muscle, but not enough to power repeated hard efforts for very long. So your body needs a very fast way to remake ATP. And that's where something called phosphocreatine comes in. Phosphocreatine, or also sometimes called creatine phosphate, can donate a phosphate group to ADP and turn it back into ATP. So think about it like this. ADP needs one more phosphate to become ATP again. Creatine phosphate gives it that phosphate, and now ATP is restored and can be used again. This is actually one of the big reasons why creatine supplementation works. Creatine supplementation can increase the amount of creatine and phosphocreatine stored in the muscle, and that gives your body more of that immediate high power energy buffer. It does not mean that creatine gives you infinite strength, and it also does not mean that you take creatine once and immediately PR. But over time, having more available creatine or phosphocreatine can help with high intensity performance and training adaptations. That's covered pretty well in this 2017 paper by the International Society of Sports and Nutrition. So if a 1 rep max is mostly ATP and phosphocreatine, where do carbs come in? Because carbs are not directly part of this phosphogen system in the same way that creatine phosphate is. For example, a banana does not instantly turn into ATP in your quads while you're squatting. That's where people can get the explanation wrong. The carbs I eat before and during a meet are not magically fueling the exact 3 seconds of the max attempt in real time. So for the actual rep itself, creatine phosphate is a huge part of the immediate energy store, but a powerlifting meet is not one isolated rep in the lab either. It's like a whole day thing. You have warm-ups, you have weighting, you have nerves, you have attempt selection, you have 3 squats, 3 benches, 3 deadlifts. You might be there for several hours. You might even have long breaks between your lifts, or you might get hyped up and then have to calm down, then get hyped up again, and you might have to take multiple heavy warm-ups before each lift. So even though the actual 1 rep max is mostly the phosphogen system, the entire day depends on more than just one energy system. And all 3 of those energy systems I just showed earlier, they interact together, and they're supposed to interact together. This is explained pretty well in this Baker et al. 2010 study. The point is that the energy systems are not just 3 separate boxes where one turns on and the others turn off. They overlap and support each other depending on intensity, duration, fatigue, and recovery. So the better way to say it is this. Creatine phosphate helps fuel the rep, carbs help fuel the day. Carbohydrates are stored in the body as glycogen, mainly in the muscles and liver. Muscle glycogen is stored carbohydrates inside the muscle. Liver glycogen helps maintain blood glucose. When you're doing repeated high-intensity efforts, warm-ups, and hard attempts across the whole day, carbohydrate availability starts to matter more. Glycolysis uses glucose or glycogen to produce ATP, and as lifting volume accumulates, glycolysis contributes more and more. So even if one maximal single is mostly the phosphogen system, The work surrounding that single is not irrelevant. Of course, your warm-ups matter, your repeated attempts matter, the long day matters, and that's why the day before the meet is also so important. The day before the meet or the max out is where I want to fill the tank. So let me give you a little bit of backstory on this. My coach has always had me eat a lot of food the day before a meet or a max out. And now I do the same with my clients and athletes. And the more I understand the physiology and feel the effects myself, the more that makes sense. The day before is not about eating something that gives you instant energy for one rep. It's about making sure you do not show up flat, depleted, underfed, or low on glycogen. The 2017 International Society of Sports and Nutrition position thing I was telling you about earlier, in there you'll see more general athletic recommendations, and a powerlifter probably does not always need endurance level carb loading, but the principle still applies. Higher carbohydrate intake helps maximize or maintain glycogen stores. In this, they talk about like 5 to 12 grams per kilogram per day, which is on the high to extremely high range. Like for a guy that weighs as much as I do right now, which is about 230 pounds or 105 kilograms, that'd mean me eating 525 to 1,260 grams of carbs per day. So for a powerlifter, I would not necessarily say you need an extreme carb load. For a lot of powerlifters, especially if you're not doing crazy volume or multiple long sessions, the upper end of that 5 to 12 grams per kilogram range is probably unnecessary. For like regular gym lifters, I wouldn't do the high end of that 5 to 12 grams per kilogram range. I would say for most people, including myself, like 3 to 5 grams per kilogram is already a solid high carb day. You can kind of fill the rest in with fat if I'm being completely honest. But if you're not cutting weight, showing up well fed and carb loaded can make a lot of sense. So maybe the day before a meet or the 2 days before a meet, you go a little extra carbs. Maybe you go that 5 grams per kilogram or maybe even a little bit more just to make sure you have enough carbs for the day of your max out. And that's kind of because a powerlifting meet is not just a single set. It is a repeated maximal expression across the whole day, or at least a big chunk of the day. And we got to be honest, resistance training does use glycogen. This 2025 systematic review and meta-analysis kind of shows that. It basically shows that resistance training sessions can significantly reduce muscle glycogen with the amount depending on things like intensity, session duration, number of sets, and training status. And that matters because powerlifting meets and max out days are not necessarily high volume bodybuilding sessions, but they are still repeated high intensity efforts with a lot of warm up work and long duration. So if I had to put this another way, the day before nutrition is basically me trying to make sure the body is stocked. So the day before or even days before, you want high enough calories, high enough carbs, normal protein, enough sodium, enough fluids, familiar foods. And that familiar foods part actually matters a lot. Like a meat day or a max out day is not the time to try new foods. It's not really the time to test some gas station sushi you saw that looked pretty good, or it's not really the time to eat some massive greasy meal that you don't normally eat. So the goal is not just eat a lot. The goal is eat a lot in a way that helps performance and does not wreck your stomach. And that's why this 2016 position paper by the I don't even want to say all that, but they basically recommend that pre-exercise meals should provide fluid, be relatively low in fat and fiber to help gastric emptying and reduce GI stress, be relatively high in carbohydrates, moderate in protein, familiar, and well tolerated. That's actually a pretty good framework, I would say. The day before, I'm not necessarily avoiding protein and fat completely, especially because those are things that I normally eat all the time and it's like very familiar to me and my stomach tolerates it pretty well. Plus, protein still matters and fat still matters. I'm not saying they're bad. I want to repeat that over and over again. I'm not saying those things are bad. Like as I get closer to the actual lifting, especially on the day of the meet, the priority shifts. The closer I am to my attempts, the more I care about quick digestion and stomach comfort. And that's why on the day of the meet or the day of the max outs, I keep protein and fat low. Protein and fats digest slower than simple carbs. They can sit heavier in your stomach, and when I'm about to squat, bench, or deadlift heavy, I don't want a heavy meal sitting in my gut. I've basically never come across any athlete that actually prefers to have this heavy meal sitting in their gut. So for me and all of my clients, on the day of the meet or the max outs, I'm mostly going for easy carbs. That might be cream of rice or bananas or honey or juice or candy or sports drinks or other simple foods. They should be things you know you tolerate well. For me on my last meet, it was a banana, a tortilla with jam, some juice, a bit of honey, and a bit of candy. And at first, for my first meet, when my coach told me just carbs, I did literally just carbs, like cream of rice instead of the tortilla. And I found that upset my stomach a bit. So instead, now I almost do pure carbs, but not quite pure carbs. Like a few grams of fat or protein from the tortilla isn't a big deal for me. Last meet was actually the first meet that I allowed a few grams of protein or fat. And it actually just kind of helped my stomach feel a little bit better. So it doesn't have to be exactly pure carbs, but I just want almost pure carbs. So the point is not that protein and fat is bad. The point is that protein and fat is not the priority in the 2 hours before a max attempt, or even more than 2 hours in some cases. Generally speaking, protein and fat is awesome. Like, protein helps build and repair the body. Fat is important for health and can fuel lower intensity activity. But on meet day or on max out day, when I care about quick digestion and high intensity performance, carbs are the tool that makes the most sense. I'm not completely sure this is worth mentioning, but there is another interesting layer to this. Carbs may not only help through digestion and metabolism, they also might help through the nervous system. There is research on something called carbohydrate mouth rinsing. I learned a bit about this while getting my exercise science degree. This is where subjects rinse carbohydrate solutions in their mouth and spit it out. They aren't necessarily swallowing it, like that's not the goal at all here. They just put it in their mouth, rinse a little bit, and then spit it out. So the benefit, if there is one, cannot be explained just by digestion and absorption. Here's one of the classic papers on this. It's this 2009 paper called Carbohydrate Sensing in the Human Mouth, Effects on Exercise Performance and Brain Activity. In that study, carbohydrate in the mouth appeared to activate areas of the brain related to reward and motor control, and it improved exercise performance in cycling time trials. One thing that makes this one particularly interesting to me is that they use maltodextrin, which apparently doesn't have a sweet flavor. I've never tried it, but apparently it just doesn't taste very sweet. So it can't really be a placebo effect. Like, it can't just be this thing where you have something sweet in your mouth and you get this placebo effect that it's going to work. Then there's also this 2010 review called Oral Carbohydrate Sensing and Exercise Performance. In this, they talk about the idea that carbohydrates can be detected in the oral cavity by receptors and seeing pathways that are not fully understood yet, and that this may be linked to improved performance. So if I had to say it in a different way, your muscles are not instantly using some Gatorade in your mouth to make ATP, but your brain may sense carbohydrate availability and respond by allowing a little more drive, arousal, and motor output. It's almost like the brain receives a signal that says fuel is available, and then you basically get a push harder because you think you have fuel available. Now, the reason I wasn't sure if I should bring this up is because I do want to be careful with the whole mouth rinsing concept. Most of the strongest carbohydrate mouth rinsing research is on endurance or repeated high intensity exercise, not necessarily powerlifting 1 rep maxes. The research on resistance training and max strength is more mixed. Some studies show possible benefits in muscular endurance or repeated work. Others show little to no effect on pure 1 rep max strength. For example, studies like this carbohydrate and caffeine mouth rinse do not affect maximal strength and maximal endurance performance. Or this other one, effects on carbohydrates and caffeine mouth rinsing on strength, blah, 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 blah. These suggest that it is not magic for maximal strength and kind of doesn't really help at all. So I would not say swishing carbs in your mouth will instantly increase your squat. I think that would honestly be way overstating the current science. But I do think it adds a useful layer to this story, because then it becomes this thing where carbs may help in 2 different ways. First, there's the normal metabolic way. You eat the carbs, you digest them, you absorb them, and maintain blood glucose and support glycogen availability. I'd say this is definitely the way they help the most. But then there's also the second way, where possibly through an oral sensing or central nervous system effect thing, carbs in the mouth may signal fuel availability to the brain and influence performance, motivation, and motor output. So if one of my clients or I is sitting at the gym or at a powerlifting meet and we're sipping on some juice or eating some candy with the homies, I'm not pretending that candy is directly powering the exact rep in real time. It's more like I'm keeping the system topped off. I'm keeping blood glucose stable. I'm staying mentally sharp. I'm avoiding hunger. I'm avoiding stomach heaviness. I'm giving myself quick, familiar fuel. And I'm maybe even getting like a small nervous system effect from having carbs in my mouth. Who knows on that last part, but it's worth mentioning, I guess. And that brings us to the full picture. The actual max attempt is mostly the phosphogen system. That's the high power immediate energy system. ATP is used directly for contraction, and phosphocreatine rapidly helps regenerate ATP by donating a phosphate to ADP. That's why creatine supplementation can help with repeated high intensity performance. But the phosphogen system does not exist in isolation. Between efforts, phosphocreatine has to recover. And that recovery is closely tied to oxidative metabolism and oxygen availability. This is why this 1999 study and this 2024 study matter. This whole energy systems working together thing is important because it corrects common oversimplifications. Like, it's just usually an oversimplification to say that a sport uses just one energy system. It's even a bit of an oversimplification to say things like glycolysis directly refuels this phosphogen system. A better way to say it is that all the energy systems interact. Glycolysis helps produce ATP during higher intensity work, especially as duration and repeated efforts accumulate. Oxidative metabolism plays a big role in recovery between efforts and restoring phosphocreatine. And carbs support that bigger system by keeping glucose and glycogen available. So the actual rep itself is probably ATP PCR dominant. The warm-ups and repeated efforts increase the relevance of glycolysis. The recovery between efforts depends heavily on oxidative metabolism, and carbs support the whole meet day or max out day environment by helping maintain fuel availability. That's why my clients and my own meet and max out nutrition is not just about the meal right before we lift. It starts the day before. The day before, I want to fill the tanks. That means enough total food, enough carbohydrates, enough sodium, enough fluids, enough familiar foods that I know digest well. It gets a little bit tricky because carbs also store with water as glycogen. This paper called Fundamentals of Glycogen Metabolism for Coaches and Athletes by Murray and Rosenblum explains that glycogen is stored with water, and that's part of why higher carb days can make you feel fuller and less flat. For a powerlifter or somebody that's just trying to get some good maxes in, that can matter. If you're not cutting weight, feeling full, hydrated, and well-fed can be a good thing. But if you're trying to make weight, that changes the strategy because you might not be able to eat a ton of carbs and hold extra water before weigh-ins. So this whole conversation kind of assumes that you're not aggressively cutting weight or that you have already handled the weigh-in situation. But if you are trying to cut weight for weigh-ins, this video helps out a ton. I've tried it before. I cut like 12 pounds in 3 days. But for me and for my clients, when I'm not worried about making weight or I'm not worried about them making weight, I want to show up fed. Then on the day of the meet, the goal changes slightly. I'm not trying to have huge mixed meals sitting in my stomach. I want enough carbs to maintain energy. I want fluids. I want sodium. I want food that feels light and predictable and easy. That's why I might eat cream of rice or bananas or honey or juice or candy or sports drinks. And that's why I'm not eating a giant high-fat, high-protein meal right before squatting. And again, for the millionth time, protein and fat are not bad. They're just not the priority right before max outs. And that's why the day of a powerlifting meet or the day of some max outs is one of the few times where eating nothing but candy would actually be just fine. I saw a video a while back of Russell Orkey. He's an amazing powerlifter, and he talked about how he likes to eat Skittles before his meets. So a shorter way to explain my whole strategy is this. The day before fills the tank. The day of keeps the tank topped off, and the food right before attempts is about quick energy, stomach comfort, and maybe a central nervous system effect. And if I had to kind of finish it with an even simpler quote or something like that, I would say creatine phosphate fuels the rep, carbs fuel the entire session or day. That's basically my main point here. When people hear I eat carbs before a meet, they might think I'm saying the carbs directly power a 1 rep max the same way gasoline powers a car. But that's not really the full physiology. The full picture is that powerlifting performance depends on immediate energy, stored fuel, nervous system output, digestion, hydration, electrolytes, and fatigue management across the whole day. The max rep itself is phosphogen system dominant, but the overall meet or the overall max out session is usually bigger than the 1 rep. And that's why I keep my nutrition simple and carb heavy. The day before I eat enough to fill up, basically a lot of food in general. It has to be stuff that won't upset your stomach though. And then the day of is easy carbs, fluids, sodium, familiar foods. And then during the meet or during the max out session, maybe in between lifts, I keep the energy steady without upsetting digestion. In a powerlifting meet, that might mean squatting, then having some carbs before bench, and then after bench, having a little bit more carbs before deadlift. So it's not about avoiding protein or fats because they're bad. You avoid a bunch of protein and fat immediately before maxing because they are not the main fuel source for that moment and they can slow digestion. Electrolytes, caffeine, and pain relievers like ibuprofen or acetaminophen can also all be helpful on the day of the meet or max out, but I'll save that for a whole different video. Anyway, if you made it to this point, thank you so much for watching my rant, and I hope it helps you on your next max out or your next meet. I'll see you guys in the next one.